This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here's the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I am, in fact, Kevin Randle, which you all can now plainly see. I'm going to be joined in just a moment by Paul Hynek. He is, of course, the son of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was the Air Force consultant to Project Blue Book for, I guess you could say, literally decades. And Paul is a Wharton MBA graduate. He's an adjunct professor of finance and accounting at Pepperdine University and the creator of a startup financial projection software that has raised over $1 billion for thousands of startups. He is a significant executive software and high-tech experience. I never can read my notes, and I do not know why. I think I'm slightly dyslexic, for those of you who wonder why I stumble on these things periodically. Anyway, he has significant executive software and high-tech experience in the U.S., Europe, and Asia. And maybe it's just its very impressive credentials outside the world of UFOs. I'm going to skip down and just say, more importantly for us here, he is the son of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was the scientific consultant to Air Force Project Blue Book for decades. Paul has an insight to his father's evolution from skeptic to champion of the extraterrestrial. And Paul has conducted his own research into UFOs and can provide his insight to where the phenomena is today and where it might go tomorrow. Paul, welcome to A Different Perspective.
Hi, Kevin. Happy to be here.
Sorry I butchered that, but I always do that for some reason. Is there something in there, your background, that you'd like to present that I didn't mention, like, having been involved?
That's okay. I've heard it all before.
I was going to say, being involved in the making of Avatar, Lord of the Rings, Planet of the Apes, Tintin, really? Tintin? I won't make fun of the French cartoon character. Real Steel, Warcraft, The Hobbit, and on and on and on. So he's got a very extensive career in the background of doing a lot of these sorts of things. So anyway, I thought I would. The first question I guess popped into my mind when I was thinking about this show was, of course, you grew up with Allen Hynek, and was that the inspiration for your interest in UFOs? And did he talk much about UFOs?
For us at home, he was an astronomer and a scientist and a professor. And so what he talked most about was astronomy. UFOs were kind of a late in life side hustle for him. And he didn't really think of himself as a UFO guy as opposed to just a professor of astronomy, which was his true passion. He did talk about UFOs a lot. I came along, my young brother and I were the two youngest children, so we were more the Close Encounters era as opposed to Project Blue Book. So he talked about it quite a lot, but often in the context of science in general. And so I don't know life without UFOs and have always found it fascinating. How can you not find this topic fascinating once you dig into it and find out that there probably is something going on?
Well, I would say not only something going on, but it's been going on for so long, and it suggests a gateway into the universe, out of our solar system, into the galaxy, and maybe beyond that, although the distances become very fast. I was going to kind of ask you about his being an astronomer and that sort of thing, because I would think that was, of course, his, I guess, passion, astronomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he knew from the age of 7 that he wanted to be an astronomer.
I went through that phase once, being an astronomer. And I went through the dinosaur phase and the being a writer phase and a journalist phase. So I went through a lot of them. Did his knowledge of astronomy, and I think that if you have a good background in astronomy, you understand some of the problems with interstellar flight and
Yeah.
the speed of light. Did he talk much about that in a scientific fashion in relation to UFOs at all?
Yeah, he did. Both he and Jacques Vallée felt that the extraterrestrial hypothesis may well have something to it, but it didn't seem to encompass the entirety of the phenomena. And as an astrophysicist, he saw real challenges with biological beings hopping into a spaceship in Zeta Reticuli and coming all this way. Just the amount of time and energy it takes, the radiation that you'd encounter along the way. And then how would they even find us? If you reduce the size of the known universe to like the continental United States, we're smaller than a speck of dust in Kansas. And even though we've been beaming out episodes of I Love Lucy these many decades, it's non-trivial just to find us. So the extraterrestrial hypothesis kind of rubs classically trained astronomers the wrong way. That doesn't mean there's not a phenomena. And one of the things my father would say is that there are two kinds of people in the world: those who are okay with questions they cannot answer, and those who are not okay with their answers being questioned. And I think a lot of people don't lean more into the UFO phenomena or other, let's say, alternative fringe phenomena because they don't have an answer. They'll say, oh, I know the New York Times has reported some really interesting cases. The Navy has pretty much admitted that they see UFOs, but I don't know where they come from. And so they stop. It's kind of an awkward intellectual resting point for someone to say, yes, I understand there's a phenomena, and I'm comfortable not knowing where they're from.
Well, I'd like to know where they're from just to see if the distances make any difference. I've always wondered the analogy I think of is an airplane flight. You can get a flight from where I live here in Iowa to Los Angeles, and it's an easy trip. But it's better if you are at a hub or in New York to get to Los Angeles because it's a much easier straight trip. And I just always wondered if the distance is factored into it in some fashion like that. And I was going to point out, and you mentioned it just briefly, the radiation. I was talking to, and I get to drop a name here, not Jalen Hynek, James Van Allen. He consented. Sure. He consented to an interview with me many, many years ago. And that was one of his concerns was as you move toward relativistic speeds, you encounter all this microscopic phenomenon, the hydrogen, I guess, in space. And that would tend to fry the occupants of your spacecraft. So the shielding would have to be incredible as well. So I think that was one of the reasons that he was willing to at least discuss the topic, and which leads into another question is, what sort of reaction did he get from his fellow astronomers being the consultant to Project Blue Book?
Well, before I tackle that, I need to sort of riff on your remark about James Van Allen. The Van Allen belts are named after him, and I am the proud owner of a Van Allen belt. And you may think, well, how could you own something that's way out in the universe? Well, he was a friend of my father, and he gave my father one of his actual belts. And I have that to this day. So I own a Van Allen belt.
Well, let me just jump in here, because when I was talking to Van Allen in the physics building at the University of Iowa, he made it clear that at the University of Iowa, they are not the Van Allen belts. They are the radiation belts. The Van Allen belt is what he uses to hold up his pants.
That's right. That's right. And to your question about other astronomers, my father and Jacques had something they called the Invisible College, which was a sort of a loose network of astronomers and scientists who in private had open views about the phenomena, but were not comfortable saying that publicly. There are a lot of examples of that. One of my favorites is Arthur C. Clarke, who had a correspondence with my father and said that in public, he didn't feel like he could talk about it, but privately he respected my father's attitude. And by the way, he had a new movie coming out called 2001. So yes. My father wrote back, and they had a nice correspondence, but he was sort of an example of a lot of people who would sort of confide privately that they were much more open to the phenomena than their public career persona would allow them to say.
So it's kind of a situation we see today with many different things. If you say the wrong thing in some private communication or something, the next thing everybody is hounding you on social media.
Yeah, if you're a professor or an Air Force pilot, talking about UFOs or flying saucers or whatever they were called at the time was not typically a fast track for advancement in your career.
Well, I think especially after Vandenberg, who was the Air Force Chief of Staff when they did the estimate of the situation,
That's right.
suggested that the evidence they had presented in the estimate did not lead to the conclusion of interplanetary as opposed to interstellar craft. And those who prepared the report found themselves out of jobs at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. They went to other places, but no longer associated with the UFO investigation. So I think that was pretty obvious to anybody who was around at that time.
And then you had Project Grudge, which I think was aptly named after that, which had a very dismissive tone overall towards the phenomenon.
Well, they didn't really do much work on it until one of the generals wondered what was going on with the UFO project and was told the truth about it. And he got, I guess, Ed Ruppelt in there with the caveat to change the attitudes and gather the information for a proper scientific study. And so for a short period of time there, 51, 52, the investigation was kind of a legitimate search for answers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's brief periods where we see evidence of genuine inquiries and research, but most of the time, like Project Blue Book, as you know, wasn't a serious scientific endeavor at all. It was a public relations exercise designed to tamp down hysteria. And as somebody once called it, it was the Society for the Explanation of the Uninvestigated.
Yeah, you can take a look at the Project Blue Book files and go through them. There's one in later years. A major was investigating a case in Florida, and in his report, he is just so dismissive and suggesting how dumb the people are for seeing these sorts of things. He's not doing an investigation. He's doing basically a hatchet job on all of that. We're gonna have to take a break here. When we come back, I want to ask you about his change in attitude, because it seemed at the beginning of his tenure as the consultant, he was skeptical, maybe debunkerish, and later on he changed his attitude. I wonder what specifically might have changed his attitude. Was there a specific case, or was just a combination of the cases that caused him to rethink that position and kind of take a different track? We'll talk about that when we come back. For those of you interested, I still do my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and I've just shown my age by telling you it's www. You all know that already. It's kevinrandle.blogspot.com. It's called A Different Perspective. There's nearly 1,500 articles on there that I have compiled over many, many years about specific aspects of the UFO phenomena, specific cases, specific investigations. So you might want to take a look at that. As I say, we'll be back in just a moment with Paul Hynek talking about his father and about UFOs. So please stick around. I am here with Paul Hynek. We're talking about his father's work with the Air Force and investigating UFOs and things like that. Before we get into that, I'm going to take a step out of the UFO field for just a second here. As many of you know, I write action adventure books under the pen name Eric Helm. And in the 1980s, produced 27, 28 books called Vietnam Ground Zero, which incorporated some of my experiences in Vietnam, but it was mainly fictional accounts of things going on there. And I mention this only because I just had a new Vietnam Ground Zero book come out after like 30 years of not having written one. And it deals with a bit of a mission involved in Vietnam that I was a tangential part of, but it's a kind of an interesting story. So if you get a chance, look up Eric Helm, and it's called Pioneer Post. And now we will go back to UFOs for those of you who are bored by my self-made commercial there. When we went away, I mentioned the change in Alan's attitude toward UFOs. And yes, I can call him Alan because he told me that many years ago I could call him Alan. Anyway, I know when the Charles Whitted sighting took place, and this was 1948, the airline pilots saw what they thought was a cigar-shaped craft whiz by their airliner, cigar-shaped object with square windows and that sort of thing. And I think your father's initial reaction was it was a meteor of some kind. And then people were, I guess, annoyed about that and thought it was something else. And now we know it probably was a meteor. And so he was right in his initial assessment about that. But it also kind of demonstrated maybe a scientific look at these sorts of things, suggesting alternative explanations. But there became a point where he changed from a skeptic questioning these things. It's not really quite right, but a skeptic looking at these things, I guess, harder than later on, and became more of an advocate for the extraterrestrial hypothesis for UFOs. Do you know what inspired that change in his attitudes?
Yeah, and I would change the framing a little bit. He actually was a debunker at first, and took pride in debunking what he thought was a lot of post-war hysteria. Later, he wasn't so much a champion for the extraterrestrial hypothesis as he was an acceptor of the accumulated weight of the data that suggested there was a phenomenon, irrespective of where they may or when they may come from. It was really sort of the frog in the hot water where it just gradually happens. You get more and more data, more and more cases from very credible witnesses that you just can't ignore anymore, no matter how you felt when you first entered the phenomena. And Jacques Vallée told me that it was the Socorro case in 1964 that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back on making my father feel comfortable speaking publicly about cases with creatures, with aliens per se. So until that point, he wasn't very comfortable talking about that. But by that point, there have been so many interesting cases that he wasn't a believer, because I don't think scientists really use that word, but he was convinced that there was a phenomenon.
Well, that brings up a question. In the Project Blue Book files, I think there are only 3 cases where creatures are mentioned that the witnesses are not labeled as pathological or having a psychological problem, if you see the alien beings. So it's an interesting thing that coming out of that environment of Project Blue Book, that a case with creatures would kind of massage his attitudes toward UFOs.
I remember talking with him around the time of Close Encounters, and it was there was a lot of stigma in terms of talking about abductions. Abductions was almost a 4-letter word. It's much more common now. But back then, just as a scientist, he was trained as a nuts and bolts astrophysicist. He wasn't trained for the kind of soft science of talking to people about the most traumatic experience they'd had. So it was a process of acclimatization to this phenomena and the more sort of out there aspects in it.
Well, it also kind of brings up a thought. I know he got pretty well slammed after the Michigan sightings when he came up with a swamp gas explanation. But I always understood that was he was sent in kind of cold to that area, and as he was getting off the airplane, the reporters were there and says, "What do you think?" And he says, "Well, it sounds like swamp gas," which is a perfectly logical thing to say if you understand the environment, you understand what was going on. But of course, there was a public reaction to that. What kind of ramifications grew out of that?
Yeah, and there was the local congressman who took great offense to that, named Gerald Ford, and that was a real stinger for him, because he tried to toe the line between being a genuine, honest scientist and working for the Air Force. And as you know, the Air Force's interest wasn't getting to the bottom of it; it's just making sure that everybody felt that they had it covered, that they didn't have to worry about it. And that was really an incident that was fairly notorious, that showed how difficult his job was of trying to make everybody calm, but not just sweeping things under the rug. And at the time, that was the first explanation he thought of, and he didn't mean to suggest that after full investigation that there was nothing more to it than swamp gas.
Well, as I say, he was caught right at the very beginning of the investigation, and it was kind of ambushed by the question. I think that was kind of as you mentioned, kind of an off the top of his head response to it. Going back to Socorro for a minute, I know from my investigations into Socorro, which grew out of this program, actually, I don't know if you know Ben Moss and Tony Angelo. who
I
did
don't.
one of they did some big research into the Socorro case, and during the program they'd said that there were more witnesses than just Lonnie Zamora, the police officer who saw the craft and the creatures. And they said that they had talked, the police had mentioned this sort of thing, and I said, did you look at the police logs? Do you have any evidence for that? And I just never got an answer from them, and I don't know why not, because the answer was right there in the Project Blue Book files. There was a Captain Holder, who was an Army officer assigned to White Sands Missile Range, who lived in the Socorro area, and he was there interviewing Zamora within hours, probably 90 minutes of the sighting. And the idea of these reports came up in the to the police, and in Holder's response that he sent to the Pentagon at about midnight that night, April 24th into April 25th, he mentioned 3 people who called the police about the event. They'd heard something, they'd seen something, they called the police, and they were blowing it off. They didn't write down any names. Nobody ever went to try to find those people. So it kind of underscored the fact that it wasn't just Lonnie Zamora, there were other witnesses. And I know your father wanted to go to La Madera, where there was a guy who'd seen a landing, I think the next day, and the Air Force denied him permission. Did he ever talk about those sort of aspects of the case?
I don't remember specific details about Socorro, but it was an ongoing theme that of additional investigation that he wanted to do, to go someplace or to get more data or to inquire of another agency. And just time after time, the Air Force said there's no need to do that or move on. So it was a continual exercise in frustration for him.
Did he ever discuss this at length with Colonel Quintanilla, who in his book, which I guess is sort of self-published, I think you can find it on the internet. He was, of course, the chief of Project Blue Book, which I know you know that, but some of the audience may not. Went on an investigation with a letter that says, he is authorized to see any top secret projects you have, which might explain this phenomenon to. Did he ever discuss Socorro specifically with Quintanilla, and the conclusion that Quintanilla came up with, that it was unidentified? He didn't have an idea what it might have been.
I don't know what conversations he had with Quintanilla. I know that their conversations weren't that long and rewarding from my father's point of view. And it's interesting. Project Blue Book officially, as you know, investigated over 12,000 cases. And even with this overriding institutional impetus to explain away all the cases, they still couldn't rubber stamp solved on over 5% or 700 of the cases, which I think is really interesting, because they wanted to just sweep them all under the rug, and even they couldn't do that.
Well, it's actually worse than that, because I did a quick survey from the index for Project Blue Book, and they labeled 4,000 to 5,000 cases insufficient data for scientific analysis, which is not an explanation. It just keeps it out of the dreaded unidentified category. So they failed at nearly half of the investigations that they. And to be fair, some of them did have insufficient data. There was one case from Texas late in the investigation where the guy learned that his sighting is labeled insufficient data, and he wanted to know why. And he said, I gave you all this information. The lieutenant who came out, he took detailed notes on this. We filled out your forms. Everything I know is in that report. What is insufficient about it? And they eventually changed the label to unidentified, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah. How many cases could there be where somebody would champion the reclassification from insufficient evidence to unidentified? That's such a nice catch-all category of insufficient data.
And it keeps it away from unidentified as well.
Right.
Did he get much blowback toward the end of his consultation with Project Blue Book after, of course, what I guess you might term the Michigan debacle, which I again stress was not his fault, but did he get much blowback from the Air Force or the public on that? Did it change
from the public? Sure. From the Air Force, I don't know, but also from James McDonald, who was a colleague of my father and who was very critical of my father being involved with Project Blue Book, because James McDonald felt that, the Air Force, especially with the Robertson Committee and the Condon Committee, the Condon report, they really wanted this sort of academic integrity to sort of whitewash their efforts. And so McDonald felt that my father, being an academic, was lending undue credence and legitimacy to this kind of sham effort. And my father felt that, yes, this was not a serious scientific effort, but having a seat at the table, having some ability to influence the operations there was worth more than staying on the outside and taking pot shots at it.
Well, I would agree with him. I think you can influence that kind of thing much more heavily. I'm going to have to take a break here in a minute. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the Content Committee, because we all know now, based on the correspondence that was released into the public arena, that it was a setup, that they were supposed to find certain things before they investigated anything. And of course, they found those specific things in their investigation. And my very favorite sighting, which was explained as a natural phenomenon so rare it had never been seen before or since. And I'm thinking, if you've got a new phenomenon out there, maybe a scientific investigation is the proper way to go. It might not take you to aliens or follow your mission of keeping the skies clear over the United States from intruders, but it certainly would be something, I think, of scientific value to take a look at. So we'll take a shot at that and the establishment of UFOs when we come back right after this. As I say, take a look at my blog at kevinrandle.blogspot.com. There's a nice piece up there about my speculation of the 12 UFO crashes that David Crush had talked about or mentioned briefly, and where I think that may go. And again, it's my speculations, but I think it's kind of an interesting take on that. So as I say, we'll be back right after this. So please stick around. And I'm suddenly back. Surprisingly, I was expecting something else in there. I was thinking about the introduction to this segment of the show, and I thought of what I wanted to say was, I'm going to make something of a liar out of myself and jump over a couple of the points I made at the very end to get into a question I think I want to get to before we run out of time. And we'll come back to these other things. And I'm thinking, in this environment, somebody will say, take that out of context. Kevin Randle says he's made himself out to be a liar. So it's about trivial things. I just jumped over a segment I'd promised a little bit earlier. Before we get into the creation of UFOs and that sort of thing, have you done much in the way of your own personal investigations into UFOs?
I've not. I would say I have my junior merit badge as a field investigator. I've done some investigations, but I'm more interested in looking at the overall data and building upon my father's close encounters classification system to sort of chart the strength of the evidence, because Close Encounters talks about the type of experience, but not so much about the specific type of evidence or how compelling it was.
But you have gone out on some field investigations.
Yes. And I actually took my father out on one in Chicago. We got a call from somebody who said, I'm an alien and I can prove it because I can look directly at the sun. And so I convinced my father to go to see this guy. So we go to the house, we knock on the door, and let's say the guy's name was Edward. And I said, hi, is Edward here? And there's an elderly couple. They said, oh, he's in the basement. And right away, I knew this was not going to be good, Kevin. So we go down in the basement, and this guy is just crazy. He's got hundreds and thousands of pennies glued over every surface. And he said something about the copper. And then at one point we're talking with him and he says, he turns off the lights, turns on black lights, and takes out this big hunting knife with like these runes written on it in sort of black light paint. And I figured, okay, well, I had to stand between him and my dad. I'd have to take it because I brought him there. And I said, hey, why don't you show us looking at the sun so we can prove that part just to get out of the house? And so we go outside. He shows us his car, again, with thousands of pennies glued everywhere, including on the tip of the cigarette lighter. And then he starts looking at the sun. And after about 3 seconds, my dad says, okay, you've proved it. That's sufficient, because he didn't want to hurt his eyes. And we left. And my father didn't say a word on the whole way back home. So I figured I hadn't really earned my stripes that day.
Well, could his pasting of the pennies, gluing of the pennies to the walls around there be an attempt to create some kind of a Faraday cage?
He may have even mentioned that, but he was so scattershot with what he said that I didn't think it was that scientifically rigorous.
Have you been out into any field investigations where you didn't run into a penny gluing lunatic?
Yes, yes. And I actually went to several sites in New Mexico with Paula Harris and Jacques. And then Jacques and I went to Socorro. And we were looking for where the ship may have touched down. And we were with Jacques' friend Larry Lemke from JPL. And we're looking around in the scrub brush. And I saw something. And I beckoned to Jacques. I said, Jacques, I think I see something here that my keen eyes are discerning. I think they may have been here. So Jacques comes up and he laughs. And the reason he laughed was that someone had positioned rocks to spell out UFO at that spot. But then Larry Lemke actually, based on his research, thinks that may have been where the Socorro ship may have landed.
Well, in my investigation of that, Philip Klass had made the claim that Lonnie Zamora, who was a police officer and basically worked for the mayor of Socorro, had created this. The two of them had created this fiction because they wanted to create a tourist attraction for Socorro. I thought the very large array would have done something of that for them, but that's just me. But the point was they had changed the location apparently. That would have been an easier location for the tourists to get to. So the real location has sort of been obscured, but the one with the UFO probably was the right spot. I don't know. But there's a lot of things like that. I mean, the cases like that, I mean, we think of Socorro as a single witness case, Lonnie Zamora, the police officer, being the only witness. And yet when you look deeper into it, you find evidences of other witnesses to that specific sighting. So it's an interesting thing that way. So since you were in New Mexico, what about Roswell?
I've never been to Roswell. So I don't know. You're one of the world experts on Roswell, so I kind of hesitate to say anything about it at all.
I think of myself as the world expert in Roswell, but I don't think that's universally accepted. Have you read much about it, or what are your feelings about it, just off the top of your head?
Well, you have the fact that the base puts out and speaks to the press saying that they've captured a flying saucer, or they have the remnants of a crashed flying saucer. And I don't know nearly as many of the details as you, but just from a mile high point of view, I imagine they were fairly sober individuals who could tell the difference between tinfoil and balsa wood and the makings of a balloon from something that's, say, more exotic or unknown. And that they went to the length to actually say, we've captured something. Now, unless they're in cahoots with the Zamora faction that would happen later and trying to make a New Mexico statewide tourist mecca, I don't know why they would have done this. It's, again, not a fast track for advancement in their career. Of course, it was backtracked the next day. But the fact is, you had some sober individuals in the press. We have the remnants of a flying saucer. So that's a hard thing for me just to move aside from.
Well, their press release, which would have, I guess, fallen at the feet of Colonel Blanchard, the base commander at the time. It was by his authority it was released. It didn't seem to impact his career because he ended up with 4 stars and was in line to become the Air Force Chief of Staff. So you have to take a look at that as well. Well, I won't hold your feet to the fire on Roswell anymore on that. I just had to do that for the short plug of my books. Take a look at Roswell in the 21st Century or Understanding Roswell, the latest 2 books on that specific case. I had mentioned that we would talk about some other things before this break. And I guess what inspired him to set up CUFOS, the Center for UFO Studies, which is now the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies in honor of your father?
Well, I think in part it was his frustration by having been shackled by the Air Force, having, as we talked about, that front row seat to all the data, but not really being able to freely use it and come to conclusions and talk about the patterns in the data. So when he left Blue Book, he was now free to do what he wanted. He had access to all the data, and he wanted to, being now an unfettered scientist, make some sense of this really enigmatic phenomenon. And what better way to do that than a nonprofit research institution?
Did he consult at all with the Condon Committee? Did they contact him at all?
He was in touch with them, and you're probably aware that he got a letter.
I was going to say, for those who don't know, Condon Committee was a University of Colorado study to look at the data from Project Blue Book and decide if there was anything of scientific value to continue the research and if the Air Force had done a good job on that sort of thing. But the project was funded by $500,000 from the Air Force, and they really had to search to find a university that would even touch the topic. So that's the background of the Condon Committee. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to bring some of the people up to date on what the Condon Committee might be. So he got a letter from the Condon Committee, or had some kind of communication with them?
Well, from the personal secretary to Professor Condon, who basically said, as you alluded to, that the fix was in. This was not an honest scientific inquiry. This was just the Air Force's attempt to shutter Project Blue Book and to have the whitewashing credibility of academia behind it. Now, it's fun for me because I was paid to speak at the University of Colorado about UFOs several years ago. So a Hynek had a better reception at the University of Colorado after a long time.
Well, that's kind of interesting. I noticed in the report there wasn't much mention of your father and that sort of thing. And one of the things that caught my attention, one of the other things that caught my attention was the Levelland case. And this was a case in November of 1957, right, in which an object approached cars and the engine stalled, and there were evidences of landing traces and multiple chains of evidence, which the Air Force kind of blown off. Did your father ever have much to say about that case? Because it was during his tenure.
I don't remember much about that case in particular, but one of the things that stands out to me about the Condon report is that the conclusion of the report doesn't even seem to jibe with the data in the report. The data in the report itself is fairly convincing, but again, they just don't even bother to look at what they're reporting to come to their pre-baked conclusion.
Kind of the situation we find ourselves in today, where we have a lot of congressional interest and scientific interest and NASA interest in UFOs, or as they want to call them, UAP. But when you watch the press conferences or read the reports, it's always, well, we're going to be doing this, and we're setting up this committee, and we're checking with these people and that sort of thing. I just did a quick report on the Arrow released a report on one of the sightings from a pilot, and they just kind of said, well, it's probably balloons, weather balloons again. And but it's the same kind of, it just struck me as it's the same kind of thing that we have been getting for literally a half a century.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to create a diversion or a disinformation technique, weather balloons have been fantastically successful, because boy, oh boy, have they appeared in so many different shapes over the years.
Well, that and experimental aircraft. And I'm testing the next generation of military fighters. I'm not going to be flying the thing all over the country for people to see and report. I'm going to limit the exposure of that craft to specific areas so that we don't give our competitors in the world a clue to what we're doing. I remember seeing a film of the F-111, F-117, the F-117, which is the fighter version. And for all the world, it looked like a dome disc coming in to land on a three-legged landing gear from the angle it was filmed. It was kind of interesting in that way. Once again, I see we're back up against the wall here on that. When we come back, I'm going to try to elicit a little bit more information about Paul Hynek, about what he thinks of what UFOs, UAP may be, and that sort of thing. and throw in a couple of my opinions if I can get a word in edgeways. No offense, Paul. But I mentioned a couple of the Roswell books a little bit earlier. The last two were Roswell in the 21st Century, which is a heavily footnoted book. And I think the chapter on the Project Mogul explanation for Roswell might be of interest to an awful lot of people because there's an awful lot of information in there. It doesn't make it into the public arena. So anyway, if you're interested in Roswell, that might be the book that you want to look at. And once again, take a look at my blog at kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And we will be back right after this with Paul Hynek. I am joined by Paul Hynek, and we're talking about, of course, his father, J. Allen Hynek, who was the Air Force consultant to Project Blue Book for literally decades. His investigations in UFOs and some of the information that I guess filtered down from his father about UFOs, which brings me to the next question. And I've heard this a number of times, that your father had said the really good reports went elsewhere. Have you any insight into what he meant by that?
Yeah, I think after the Robertson panel, there was kind of a bifurcation, and the really juicy reports would go to the Air Intelligence Service Squadron, as opposed to Project Blue Book, which is a very frustrating thing for my dad.
Did he ever get a look at any of those kind of reports, or was it just something in the ether that he picked up on?
I think he caught wind of some of them, and especially in later years, he heard about them. But yeah, at the time, he wasn't able to investigate some of those best cases.
Well, I know that it was the 4602 second Air Intelligence Service Squadron. I think that's the designation of it, that was given the task of investigating UFOs back in the 1952, when Ed Ruppelt, who was the chief of Blue Book, complained about all the reports coming in during the summer of 1952 and having the capability of investigating all of those. So they tasked this organization whose mission was actually to train to respond to downed airmen.
Right, of any kind. Right.
In the war, war situation, interrogation of prisoners and that sort of thing. So they're trained in a lot of esoteric activities like horseback riding and skiing, so they could get to the out of the way places, the capture of downed airmen and that sort of thing. I got the impression from reading the documents about that they just treated that as more of a training exercise than a real attempt to gather sufficient data. Did you get that kind of an impression too, or are you that familiar with it?
Well, my understanding is they had an overall mission of getting to any crash site of any kind, plane, balloon, flying saucer, whatever, within 6 hours. And they also had Russian speakers. So they had a sort of all-encompassing job to get to a crash site, but contain any kind of fallout, whether it's nuclear or information. And so a lot of people think the Men in Black came from them as part of their efforts to contain an entire situation around a crash site.
But did your father ever see any reports that came from them? There was a lot of things that I've seen that suggest it was all pretty much mundane, meaning terrestrially based. And I would suspect that's because if it led into the extraterrestrial or something very exotic, that it would have a higher classification.
And you'd have to think there wouldn't be nearly as many crashes of flying saucers as there would be of airplanes. And that's always something that is a little bit confusing to me. If you're an alien coming from another planet and you're able to make it to find Earth and get all the way here, why is it that you suddenly can't fly anymore and you crash? I don't understand that.
I think it's somebody pushed the wrong button.
Yeah, it could be. Maybe you're not having the aces go out all the way out to Earth. You're having sort of the B-list pilots.
Yeah, I just, well, why would they crash? I think somebody pushed the wrong button. The craft may be functioning perfectly, but the crew may have made an error. Which kind of leads.
And we may have a different kind of atmosphere that they haven't adjusted to. That's possible as well.
Well, I was going to add, or there's atmospheric phenomena that they're not used to. Lightning may not be something that's big on their home planet, so they don't plan for it. Or the composition of the atmosphere has some kind of eroding effect on their materials. Which kind of leads me to another question. You're familiar with Project Moondust?
Not really, no.
Oh, that was that carried on beyond the end of Project Blue Book. And there was a lot of different agencies. It came out in 1986. The State Department dumped a bunch of documents, and some of them were labeled moon dust. And I actually found cases in the Project Blue Book files labeled moon dust. And so it was, I don't want to say a project in the sense that you had some kind of a structured office environment and hierarchy, but it was the code name for if you get a UFO report after the end of Blue Book, you use the code word moon dust. So it was a code word for it to classify it. And there are some interesting reports that came out of that. But I guess your father never mentioned moon dust at all.
No, I haven't heard of it before.
Oh, gee, I haven't done a good job of selling that book then, have I? Well, I of course did a book on Project Moondust and updated it not that long ago. So again, short commercial message. If you want to know about Moondust, the latest information is out there somewhere on the internet.
Well, you just got one sale right here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the 25 cents of the royalty I will earn on that. People have the idea we could write a book and we earn hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties, and most of the cover price goes to other people, which is a argument I should have with someone else, I suppose. So you've become very interested in UFOs, obviously, and you're going to be in Nevada here in the next few weeks at their Contact in the Desert or Encounter in the Desert?
Yeah, in Palm Desert, California. Yes.
What are you going to be talking about there?
So I'll be moderating a panel and on several panels and giving 3 presentations. One of them is Ufology 101, just a sort of primer for the UFO curious. Another one is on my evidence protocol to help people, if they want, demonstrate the objective reality of supernatural encounters. And the other one is a bit further out there. I call it Bitcoin astronomy. And it's what the nexus that I believe exists between UFOs, DMT, and Bitcoin.
Yeah, it is kind of out there. You kind of alluded to this earlier, suggesting that the extraterrestrial solution to UFOs may not be the all-encompassing solution. What other things do you think might contribute it? I mean, thinking time travelers, interdimensional communications? How do you rate all of that, putting it into the context of the UFO phenomenon?
I'll include it, but not rate it because it's so difficult. I think Michael Masters does a really good job explaining the time travel theory. I lean personally towards interdimensional. I know my father and Jacques both thought because of what they call the Cheshire Cat phenomenon, where ships would appear and then disappear or go at right angles at very high velocities that didn't really seem to obey our understanding of the laws of physics. Also, interdimensional theory, to me, answers the question of how would they know we're here? Well, they're kind of adjacent to us in some kind of quantum way, and they may be related to us in some way. So that would explain how they find us and why they would care about us. So yeah, I think interdimensional for me, it just kind of seems to ring true with some of the more esoteric aspects of the phenomenon.
Do you place it above interstellar flight, or is it below there, or on a level playing field with it?
Yeah. For what it's worth, I lean more towards that than extraterrestrial. I just extraterrestrial seems very difficult, and I don't know why anybody would go that far to come and see us and not be more overt in their behavior.
Anthropologists studying a primitive society.
Could be.
The prime directive. Of course, then you fall back to Philip Klass's claim. Well, if they're trying to stay hidden, they should turn off the lights.
That's right.
So I was also wondering about your father's feelings about, you mentioned he and Jacques Vallée, and I know Jacques Vallée has kind of been in the not the nuts and bolts camp for a while. Your father, was he more nuts and bolts, or was he more interdimensional?
Oh, I think he started off as no nuts or bolts, and then nuts and bolts, and then probably not nuts and bolts. I think that probably describes his trajectory.
Well, I would also think that a single answer probably doesn't explain all parts of the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah. Because
there may be.
I like the word he used was meta-terrestrial, which I interpret to mean things beyond our public understanding of terrestrial technology. So that could be top secret Pentagon technology. It could be, entities underground, in the water, in another dimension from other planets. It's a sort of all-encompassing term, blanket term, to mean something just beyond our known understanding.
So
or even perhaps collective unconscious.
So you're suggesting multiple answers to the phenomenon, not a single answer.
Yeah, I think you said it very well, that there probably is. I think it's like kind of like onion layers. And Jacques once said that when all the interstellar dust settles, that the only and exclusive answer to the phenomena is extraterrestrial, he'll be disappointed. It just seems like I think we'll be at this for hundreds of years, because I just don't see any one answer encompassing all the things that make up what we feel are credible and really interesting cases.
Well, we're out of time here, but before I go, I'll make one comment. You mentioned how would they find us? And we think of the electromagnetic impulses we're broadcasting out. All our TV shows are now in the some of them could be 100 light years from Earth, and they could pick up those signals. And the thing that's always frightened me is the one program they got was Laverne and Shirley, about these two poor girls who aren't the brightest bulbs in the display. What would they think of the human race based on that?
Well, what if they come
do
here
you
and
have
ask
a website or books or?
No, not really.
Well, we know that. That's been solved.
Right. I'm on Twitter at Paul Hynek, but I have a pretty anemic social media footprint.
Okay, and you don't have a website or anything like that?
Not really, no.
And have you done any books that you've done some interesting films? I've been involved with those, but no books or anything like that you'd like to hawk here at the very end?
No, thank you. Not yet. Maybe next time.
Well, you'll be out there in the desert in Nevada in a couple of weeks, so people can look you up and attend your presentations and watch you on the panel. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon to be with us, talking about your father's investigation. I think we got some good insight into what his feelings were, and some good insight into how the Air Force investigation worked, and how you ended up at the point where you are as well. So thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Kevin.
Okay. And we'll talk to you later, I'm sure.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. So anyway, folks, that was Paul Hynek. You've got the dope there. Again, there's my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And I do that because I said it for so long that way. There's a couple of new books out, and there's one called 1973, which is a look at the 1973 Pascagoula abduction case, with I think some new information there, and a suggestion that if there is alien abduction, this is the one we need to be taking a look at, because there's multiple witnesses to the abduction. Anyway, I will be back next week talking about UFOs and that sort of thing. So I'll see you then.